If you clicked on this video, you're about to discover why certain quantum experiments are never mentioned in mainstream science education, never discussed in popular physics, never shared in spiritual teachings that claim to be based on quantum mechanics. Not because these experiments failed, not because they were disproven, but because they succeeded too well. Because they demonstrated something so profound, so destabilizing to consensus reality, so threatening to established worldviews that they were quietly buried, removed from curriculum, dismissed as anomalies that shouldn't be replicated or examined too closely. There's an experiment, actually conducted, properly documented, peer-reviewed and published, that proves consciousness doesn't just observe reality. Consciousness creates reality, not metaphorically, not theoretically, actually measurably, repeatably creates it. The experiment shows that human intention, human focus, human consciousness directly affects physical matter in ways that can't be explained by any known mechanism except one. Consciousness and matter aren't separate. They're different expressions of the same quantum field, and consciousness has direct causal influence over how that field manifests as physical reality. The experiment was conducted at Princeton University's Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, ran for nearly 3 decades, involved millions of trials, used rigorous scientific methodology, and demonstrated beyond statistical doubt that human consciousness affects random number generators, that intention influences probability distribution, that mind directly impacts matter. The results were so clear, so consistent, so undeniable that they couldn't be dismissed as experimental error or coincidence. So instead, they were ignored. Funding was cut. Lab was closed. Results were buried in academic journals nobody reads. An experiment disappeared from public awareness. Can you feel why that happened? Why experiment proving consciousness creates reality would be suppressed rather than celebrated? Because if consciousness creates reality, entire structures of power and control collapse. If you can influence probability through intention, you're not powerless victim of circumstances. If mind affects matter directly, you're not dependent on external authority to change your experience. If consciousness is creative force rather than passive observer, you don't need to be saved or fixed or guided by those claiming to know better than you. The experiment proves what mystics have taught for millennia. You are creator, not creation. And that truth threatens every system built on convincing you otherwise. Quantum physics has proven that observer affects observed at quantum level. The famous double-slit experiment shows particles behave differently when observed versus unobserved. But this forbidden experiment goes further. It proves the observer effect isn't just about measurement collapsing wave function. It's about consciousness directing collapse, about intention determining which probability manifests, about your awareness actively participating in creating reality rather than just passively observing it. And that active participation is precisely what you're never supposed to know you're capable of. But you're here. You clicked. Something in you already suspected this truth. Already felt that you're more than biological machine experiencing predetermined reality. Already sensed that consciousness has power that culture systematically denies and suppresses. And now you're about to see the scientific proof that validates what you've always intuitively known. You're not just observer. You're creator. Not someday after enough spiritual practice. Right now, in every moment, through the simple act of conscious observation combined with intention. Take a breath. Deep one. Because what comes next isn't just information, it's activation. Once you see the proof, once you understand the mechanism, once you recognize your creative power isn't spiritual fantasy, but scientific reality. You can't unknow it. You can't return to believing you're powerless. You can't pretend consciousness doesn't affect reality. And that's why this experiment was forbidden, not because it's false, because it's true. and truth is dangerous to systems built on your unconsciousness of your own power. Before revealing what the forbidden experiment actually demonstrated, you need to understand what was at stake scientifically and culturally. Because the suppression wasn't random, it was systematic response to results that threatened fundamental assumptions upon which modern worldview is built. Results that proved those assumptions false. Results that required complete paradigm shift that institutions weren't willing to make. The first assumption the experiment threatened: consciousness is brain activity with no influence beyond body. Materialist science insists consciousness is epiphenomenon, meaningless byproduct of neurons firing that has no causal power, no influence on physical world, no significance beyond subjective experience trapped in skull. This assumption is foundation of entire materialist paradigm. If consciousness is just brain activity, then you're just biological machine. Your thoughts have no power. Your intentions create nothing. You're passive recipient of reality determined by external forces beyond your control. But if consciousness affects physical systems outside body, if intention influences random number generators, if focus changes probability distributions, if awareness directly impacts matter at distance, then consciousness isn't just brain activity. Consciousness is fundamental force that interacts with physical reality in ways materialism can't explain. And if materialism can't explain consciousness, then entire worldview built on materialist assumptions collapses. Everything modern science says about human nature, about reality, about your place in universe, all of it requires radical revision. The second assumption experiment threatened: reality is objective, external, independent of observation. Classical physics treats reality as out there, solid, fixed, operating according to mechanistic laws, regardless of whether anyone observes it. You're observer of objective reality, not participant in creating it. This assumption justifies entire approach to knowledge, to science, to understanding truth. Observe objectively, measure precisely, discover laws that govern independent reality. Your observation doesn't affect what you observe. Reality is what it is regardless of you. But quantum mechanics already demonstrated this isn't true at quantum level. Observation affects what's observed. Particles exist in superposition until measured. Observer participates in determining outcome. But mainstream science contained this truth by saying it only applies to quantum scale. Microscopic particles behaving strangely, while macroscopic reality remains objective and independent. Forbidden experiment demolished that containment. It showed observer effect operates at macroscopic level. Human consciousness affects physical systems. Random isn't actually random when consciousness focuses intention on outcome. Reality isn't independent. It responds to observation. The third assumption experiment threatened: probability is just mathematical description of uncertainty with no ontological reality. Standard interpretation says probability in quantum mechanics just describes our ignorance. We don't know which state particle is in until measured, so we use probability to describe uncertainty. But particle is really in definite state even before measurement. We just don't know which state until we look. This interpretation preserves determinism. Reality is determined. We're just uncertain about details. But forbidden experiment demonstrates something different. Probability has ontological reality. It exists as real potential that consciousness can influence. When consciousness focuses intention on outcome, probability distribution shifts measurably. This doesn't fit standard interpretation. If probability is just our ignorance, consciousness shouldn't be able to influence it. But consciousness does influence it, consistently and significantly, which means probability isn't just mathematical abstraction. Probability is real field of potential that responds to consciousness, that shifts based on intention, that consciousness participates in collapsing into manifestation. Understanding these assumptions reveals why experiment was suppressed. Results didn't just challenge one idea. Results undermined entire paradigm, materialism, objectivity, determinism, all the assumptions modern worldview depends on. Accepting results would require acknowledging consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative. Reality is participatory rather than objective. Probability is creative field rather than mathematical description. That's not modification of existing paradigm. That's complete paradigm shift. And institutions built on old paradigm weren't willing to make that shift, even when evidence demanded it. Now we arrive at what the forbidden experiment actually was, and what it demonstrated. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, directed by Robert Jahn and Brenda Dunn, designed elegant test of whether human consciousness could influence physical systems. They used random event generators, electronic devices that produce completely random sequences of ones and zeros, 50-50 probability, no pattern, no bias. Perfect randomness. Or so materialism assumes. The experiment was simple. Participants sat in front of random event generator and were asked to mentally intend for device to produce more ones than zeros, or more zeros than ones, or to remain random as baseline. No physical contact, no manipulation, just consciousness focusing intention on device. If consciousness has no influence on physical systems, results should remain perfectly random, regardless of intention. 50-50 split, no deviation, no correlation between intention and outcome. But that's not what happened. Over millions of trials, across thousands of participants, spanning 3 decades of continuous testing, consciousness consistently influenced the output. When participants intended more ones, device produced more ones than probability predicts. When they intended more zeros appeared. The effect was small, shifting probability from 50-50 to approximately 51-49. But it was consistent, statistically significant, and absolutely shouldn't exist according to materialist paradigm. Small effect, but profound implications. If consciousness can shift probability even slightly, consciousness is directly affecting physical system through no known mechanism. Not through electromagnetic radiation from brain, that was tested and ruled out. Not through vibration or heat or any physical force, those were controlled for. The influence was non-local, non-physical, operating through means that materialism can't explain. The only explanation is consciousness itself has causal power over physical reality. Mind affects matter directly through quantum interaction. The experiment was replicated at multiple laboratories worldwide. Same results. Same consistent deviation from randomness when consciousness focused intention. Same statistical significance. Same demonstration that observer isn't just passive. Observer actively influences observed system through intention. This wasn't anomaly occurring once and disappearing. This was repeatable, verifiable, peer-reviewed scientific evidence that consciousness creates reality. But here's what makes results even more significant. The effect correlated with participants' emotional state and belief. When participants felt connected to device, believed they could influence it, approached task with focused but relaxed attention, effect was stronger. When they felt disconnected, doubted their influence, approached with anxiety or excessive effort, effect diminished or disappeared. This showed influence isn't random anomaly. Influence is conscious participation that requires specific quality of attention, specific emotional state, specific belief about possibility. The consciousness affecting reality isn't just any consciousness. It's conscious consciousness. Awareness that knows it can influence, believes it can create, focuses with relaxed intention rather than desperate forcing. This correlation between belief and effect is what mainstream science found most threatening, because it suggests reality isn't just responding to consciousness, Reality responds to how consciousness relates to itself. If you believe you can influence probability, you can. If you doubt you can, you can't. Your belief about your creative power directly affects your creative power. Which means the cultural conditioning telling you you're powerless isn't just wrong. That conditioning actively prevents you from accessing power you actually have. And once people recognize that their powerlessness is learned rather than inherent, entire structures built on that learned powerlessness become vulnerable. The suppression of this experiment reveals how threatening these results were to established paradigms. The Princeton lab published dozens of peer-reviewed papers showing statistically significant effects, presented results at academic conferences, demonstrated experiment to skeptics who couldn't find methodological flaws. Yet somehow, this groundbreaking research demonstrating consciousness affects physical reality never made it into physics textbooks, never appeared in mainstream science education, never became foundation for new research programs exploring human creative potential. Instead, funding was denied. Lab was closed in 2007. Research was dismissed as fringe, despite meeting every standard of scientific rigor. Skeptics claimed effects were too small to matter, ignoring that consistent deviation from randomness across millions of trials is scientifically significant regardless of effect size. Critics said results could be experimental artifacts, even though multiple labs replicated findings using different equipment and protocols. Mainstream science simply refused to engage with evidence that threatened materialist assumptions. But suppression went beyond ignoring research. There was active effort to discredit and dismiss. Skeptics launched attacks questioning methodology despite never successfully identifying actual flaws. Academic journals that published early results became reluctant to publish later findings. Students interested in researching consciousness effects were discouraged by advisors who warned such research would damage their careers. Implicit message was clear. Exploring consciousness's creative power is professional suicide in academic establishment committed to materialist worldview. This pattern of suppression isn't unique to Princeton experiments. Throughout history, research demonstrating consciousness affects reality has been systematically marginalized. From early parapsychology studies showing telepathy and precognition, to Soviet research on psychokinesis, to modern experiments demonstrating intention influences physical systems, any evidence that consciousness is more than brain activity gets dismissed, attacked, or buried. Not because evidence is weak, because implications are too threatening to power structures built on your unconsciousness of your creative capacity. Think about why this suppression serves established interests. If people believe they're powerless, just biological machines experiencing predetermined reality, they remain dependent on external authority, dependent on governments to manage society, dependent on corporations to provide necessities, dependent on experts to explain reality, dependent on institutions to solve problems. But if people recognize they're conscious creators directly influencing reality through intention, dependency collapses. Authority that claimed to know better than you loses justification when you recognize you have direct access to creative power. Systems built on your powerlessness become obsolete when you discover you were never actually powerless. The forbidden experiment proves what spiritual teachers have taught for millennia. You are creator, experiencing yourself as creation. Not metaphorically, literally. Your consciousness directly influences quantum field that manifests as physical reality. Your intention affects probability of outcomes. Your focus shapes what manifests. Your belief about your creative power determines how effectively you can use that power. And culture systematically conditions you to forget this truth, to believe you're powerless, to remain unconscious of creative capacity that threatens every institution benefiting from your unconsciousness. But you can't suppress truth forever. Experiment was conducted, results were published. Evidence exists for anyone willing to look. And now you're seeing it. Now you know. Not as spiritual belief, but as scientific fact, consciousness affects reality, you affect reality. Through simple act of focused intention combined with belief in possibility. The question isn't whether you have this power, science proved you do. The question is whether you'll use it consciously or remain unconscious of it, while it operates automatically through whatever beliefs and intentions you hold unconsciously. 9 years ago, I discovered this forbidden experiment buried in academic journal I wasn't supposed to be reading. I was researching consciousness studies for completely different reason when I stumbled across paper describing Princeton Labs results. And I remember thinking, if this is real, if consciousness actually affects physical systems measurably, why isn't this foundational to how we teach physics, psychology, human potential? Why isn't every scientist exploring this? Why isn't this transforming how we understand ourselves? Then I understood. It wasn't in textbooks because it was too true. Results were so clear, implications so profound, threat to established paradigms so complete that suppression was only way to maintain status quo. If people knew they could influence probability through intention, if students learned consciousness creates reality, if everyone understood they have direct creative power over their experience, entire educational, economic, and political systems built on learned helplessness would collapse. I started experimenting myself, not with random event generators. I didn't have access to that equipment, but with simple tests of whether consciousness could influence probability in everyday life. Mentally intending for specific parking spot to be available, focusing intention on particular outcome in ambiguous situation, holding clear intention while making decision that had uncertain results, and watching whether outcomes correlated with intention more than chance predicts. The correlation was undeniable, not every time. Just like Princeton results showed small but consistent deviation from randomness, but consistently enough that I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. When I held clear, relaxed intention without attachment to outcome, circumstances aligned with that intention significantly more than randomness explains. When I doubted or tried too hard, correlation disappeared. The quality of consciousness mattered, just like Princeton experiments demonstrated. Belief, focus, and relaxed attention created measurable influence on probability. That direct experience shifted everything. Reading about experiment was one thing. Personally verifying that consciousness influences reality was completely different. Suddenly, every choice became quantum experiment. Every intention became test of creative power. Every moment became opportunity to consciously participate in creating experience rather than unconsciously accepting whatever random circumstances appeared. The shift wasn't just intellectual. The shift was recognizing I'm not powerless observer of predetermined reality. I'm conscious creator, actively influencing what manifests through how I focus awareness. This is what I wish someone had shown me decades earlier. The forbidden experiment isn't just interesting scientific anomaly. It's proof that everything spiritual teachings say about consciousness creating reality is scientifically verified fact. You don't need to believe in manifestation. You don't need faith in consciousness affecting reality. You can know it works because science proved it works. Not perfectly, not magically, not guaranteeing specific outcomes, but consistently shifting probability in direction of intention when consciousness focuses with right quality of attention. Your situation might be different from mine. Your verification of creative power might come through different experiments, but principle is same. Consciousness affects reality. Not someday after enlightenment, now. Through mechanisms so well documented that only systematic suppression could keep it hidden from public awareness. And now you know. Now you've seen the proof. Now you understand why this experiment was forbidden. Because once you recognize your creative power, you can't be convinced you're powerless anymore. To use the knowledge from forbidden experiment consciously rather than accidentally, you need to understand the specific conditions that made participants successful in influencing random event generators. Because not everyone succeeded equally. Some participants showed strong, consistent effects. Others showed no effect. And the difference wasn't random. It correlated with specific qualities of consciousness that can be developed deliberately. The first quality is relaxed focus. Participants who succeeded didn't try hard or strain with effort. They held intention lightly while remaining focused. Like aiming arrow, you need clear aim, but if you grip too tight or pull too hard, accuracy suffers. Consciousness influencing probability requires same balance. Clear intention without desperate attachment to outcome. Relaxed focus allows quantum influence. Desperate forcing creates interference. Most people fail at conscious creation not because they lack power, but because they try too hard, creating tension that blocks natural influence consciousness has. The second quality is belief in possibility. Participants who believed they could influence device showed stronger effects than those who doubted, not positive thinking or forcing belief. Genuine recognition that consciousness affecting matter is possible. Doubt doesn't just create negative expectation. Doubt creates quantum interference that prevents consciousness from influencing probability. You can't effectively intend for outcome you fundamentally believe is impossible. The belief doesn't create the power. The power exists regardless. But belief removes interference that blocks power from operating. The third quality is emotional connection. Participants who felt connected to device, who approached experiment with genuine interest rather than detached skepticism, showed stronger effects. This suggests consciousness influences reality not through cold mental intention, but through engaged awareness. When you care about outcome, when you feel connected to what you're influencing, when you're emotionally present rather than intellectually detached, quantum influence strengthens. The caring doesn't manipulate reality. The caring creates coherence between consciousness and quantum field that allows influence to occur naturally. The fourth quality is present moment awareness. Effects were stronger when participants were fully present, not distracted, not thinking about past or future, but focused in now. This makes quantum sense. Influence happens in present moment where quantum field exists and where probability collapses into outcome. If consciousness is mentally elsewhere, it's not available to influence present moment probability. Presence isn't spiritual practice separate from manifestation. Presence is mechanism through which manifestation occurs. The fifth quality is non-attachment to specific outcome. Paradoxically, participants who held intention but weren't desperately attached to result showed stronger effects than those who needed specific outcome. This doesn't mean not caring. This means caring about intention while releasing need to control exactly how intention manifests. Attachment creates tension. Non-attachment creates flow. And flow state is where consciousness most effectively influences quantum field because there's no internal conflict interfering with natural creative power. Practice developing these qualities not as techniques to perform, but as natural way of being. Hold intentions clearly but lightly. Believe in possibility without forcing conviction. Feel connected to what you're creating. Stay present in moment where creation occurs. Care about outcomes while releasing desperate attachment. These aren't steps to follow mechanically. These are qualities of consciousness that allow natural creative power to operate without interference from ego's need to control, doubt's need to prevent, or desperation's need to force. Right now, You can test this. Think of simple intention, something you want to influence in next 24 hours. Hold that intention clearly in awareness. Feel connection to outcome. Believe it's possible for consciousness to influence probability. Stay present rather than projecting into future. Then release attachment and go about your day. Watch whether outcome correlates with intention more than chance predicts. Not as proof you need to convince yourself. As personal verification of what science already demonstrated, consciousness affects reality when it operates with right qualities. Something crucial about forbidden experiment that most people miss. The effect wasn't constant across all participants or all sessions. Same person could show strong effects one day and no effects another day. This variability wasn't random error. It revealed something profound about consciousness's creative power. The power exists always, but ability to access and use that power fluctuates based on consciousness's state. Which means conscious creation isn't about having special ability some people possess and others lack. It's about accessing ability everyone has, but most people block through unconscious patterns. The patterns that blocked influence were identifiable and consistent. When participants approached experiment with performance anxiety, needing to succeed, fearing failure, trying to prove ability, effects diminished or disappeared. Anxiety creates internal conflict. Part of consciousness intending outcome, while another part doubting or fearing or forcing. That conflict creates quantum interference. Consciousness can't effectively influence probability when it's working against itself. The trying itself becomes blocking mechanism. When participants were distracted, thinking about other things, not fully engaged, going through motions without genuine focus, no effects occurred. This proved influence requires consciousness to be actually present and focused. You can't create consciously while being unconscious. You can't influence probability while attention is elsewhere. The presence isn't optional spiritual practice. Presence is necessary condition for consciousness to interface with quantum field in way that influences how probability manifests. When participants had strong preconceived expectations about how influence should manifest, needing device to respond immediately, expecting dramatic shifts rather than subtle deviations, demanding specific evidence, effects often reversed. This suggested ego's need for control creates interference stronger than intention's influence. Consciousness affects probability when it allows influence to occur naturally. Ego demanding specific proof actually prevents proof from appearing because demand creates the tension and control that block natural creative flow. But when participants were in flow state, engaged but relaxed, focused but not forcing, interested but not attached, effects were strongest. Flow state is where consciousness operates most effectively because there's no internal interference, no doubt blocking possibility, no anxiety creating conflict, no control demanding specific outcomes, no distraction pulling awareness away, just consciousness present, focused, and allowing its natural influence on quantum field to operate without interference from patterns that normally block that influence. This reveals something revolutionary about conscious creation. You're not trying to develop power you lack. You're removing interference that blocks power you already have. Every moment, your consciousness is influencing quantum field. Every moment, your awareness is participating in collapsing probability. Every moment, you're creating experience through how you interface with reality. But most of that creation is unconscious, operating through patterns, beliefs, and states you're not aware of. Conscious creation isn't adding something. Conscious creation is making conscious what's already occurring and removing interference that prevents it from operating in alignment with your actual intentions. The forbidden experiment proved this mechanically. Participants didn't need training to influence devices. They needed removal of interference, removal of doubt, removal of anxiety, removal of forcing, removal of distraction. When those blocks dissolved and consciousness entered natural flow state, influence appeared automatically. Not because flow state creates special power, because flow state removes interference that was blocking power that exists always. You don't become creator. You recognize you've always been creator, and you stop blocking yourself from creating consciously. What's happening individually as you learn about Forbidden Experiment is happening collectively to millions globally. This isn't isolated awakening to creative power. This is species-wide recognition that consciousness affects reality, that scientific proof exists validating what mystics taught, that you're not powerless observer but conscious creator. And this collective recognition is reaching threshold where suppression can no longer contain truth that threatens old paradigm. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance shows that as more individuals recognize truth, recognition becomes easier for everyone through resonance in collective field. First person who discovered consciousness affects matter had to overcome total cultural conditioning, saying it's impossible. Second person found it slightly easier. 100th person easier still. And now, after decades of research and millions of trials proving consciousness influences reality, recognition is available to anyone willing to look at evidence rather than accepting cultural narrative that systematically denies your creative power. You're benefiting from everyone who came before, from Princeton researchers who risked careers to prove consciousness matters, from participants who demonstrated influence despite skeptics, from scientists worldwide who replicated results proving this wasn't anomaly, from teachers who shared truth despite suppression. They created morphic field, they established possibility, they proved scientifically what mystics knew experientially. And their work makes your recognition easier, your creative power more accessible, your verification of consciousness affecting reality more natural. And when you recognize your creative power, when you verify through direct experience that consciousness influences probability, when you start using this knowledge consciously, you strengthen field for everyone approaching this recognition. Your awakening serves collective, makes it easier for others to discover scientific proof of what they've intuitively sensed, contributes to species evolution from unconscious creation to conscious participation in reality formation. But there's something else happening at collective level that makes this moment unique. The suppression is failing. Internet allows information to spread despite institutional gatekeeping. Independent researchers can publish findings without academic approval. People can access forbidden experiments without permission from authorities who benefit from your ignorance of creative power. The monopoly on truth that mainstream science held for centuries is breaking. And as it breaks, evidence of consciousness affecting reality is becoming undeniable to growing numbers of people. This creates feedback loop that accelerates awakening. More people recognize creative power. More people experiment and verify it works. More people share experiences showing consciousness affects reality. More evidence accumulates that materialist paradigm is incomplete. More pressure builds on institutions to acknowledge what evidence demonstrates. Eventually, critical mass is reached where paradigm shift can't be prevented anymore. Where acknowledging consciousness creates reality becomes mainstream rather than fringe. Where your creative power is taught in schools rather than systematically denied. You're part of that tipping point. Your recognition matters beyond personal transformation. Your verification of creative power contributes to collective evidence. Your conscious use of influence on probability strengthens morphic field that makes recognition available to everyone. You're not just learning about forbidden experiment, you're participating in collective awakening that forbidden experiment was trying to prevent by being suppressed. And participation in that awakening is what truly threatens established paradigm. Not individual enlightenment, but collective recognition that everyone has creative power that culture systematically denies. There's a choice approaching that determines whether knowledge of forbidden experiment transforms your life or remains interesting information you eventually forget. Choice between continuing to operate from learned helplessness while knowing intellectually you have creative power versus actually using that power consciously in every decision, every intention, every moment. Between treating consciousness affecting reality as fascinating concept versus recognizing it as practical mechanism you can use deliberately to influence your experience. This choice can't be made from ego. Ego will want to use creative power to control outcomes, to get what it wants, to prove it's special or powerful. But trying to use consciousness's influence for ego agenda creates the interference that blocks influence. Ego's desire to control is exactly what prevents natural influence from operating. Ego's need to prove power demonstrates doubt that power exists, and that doubt creates quantum interference stronger than intention's influence. You can't effectively use creative power from ego's controlling, desperate trying. You can only use it from consciousness's relaxed allowing. The choice has to come from recognizing what you actually are. You're not ego trying to gain power over reality. You're consciousness that's always been creating reality, and now you're becoming aware of creative process you've been using unconsciously. The shift isn't from powerless to powerful. The shift is from unconscious creation to conscious creation. From accidentally influencing probability through whatever beliefs and intentions operate automatically, to deliberately influencing probability through chosen focus and relaxed intention. Ancient teachings call this shift remembering rather than learning. You're not learning something new. You're remembering what you've always been capable of, but temporarily forgot through cultural conditioning. Forbidden experiment doesn't give you creative power, it proves you already have it. Scientific evidence doesn't create your influence on reality. It validates influence that's been operating your entire life. Recognition doesn't make you creator. It reveals you've always been creator who mistakenly believed you were just creation. This choice becomes easier when you recognize what's actually at stake. Not whether you'll become manifestation master who gets everything you desire, but whether you'll remain unconscious of how you're already creating experience through beliefs and intentions you don't examine, or become conscious of creative process so you can participate deliberately rather than accidentally. Whether you'll stay trapped in learned helplessness despite knowing scientifically it's false, or step into conscious creative participation despite ego's resistance to surrendering control. I faced this choice 7 years ago after verifying for myself that consciousness influences probability. Ego wanted to use discovery to manifest specific outcomes, to prove I had special power, to control reality through intention. But that using created interference that prevented influence from working. Eventually, I recognized I'm not trying to gain power I lack. I'm removing interference that blocks power I have. Not trying to control reality. Allowing consciousness to influence probability naturally when I'm in flow state without ego's interference. That recognition shifted everything. From trying to make manifestation happen through effort and technique, to allowing manifestation to occur through relaxed intention and removal of interference. From forcing outcomes through desperate need, to influencing probability through genuine focus without attachment. From using creative power to get what ego wants, to recognizing I am creative power expressing through this particular form, and what wants to manifest through me emerges naturally when I stop blocking it with doubt, anxiety, forcing, or control. Once you recognize creative power proven by forbidden experiment and begin using it consciously, life from that recognition looks radically different from life of learned helplessness. Not because circumstances become perfect, they don't necessarily, but because relationship with circumstances transforms completely. You're no longer passive victim experiencing predetermined reality. You're conscious participant, actively influencing what manifests through quality of your attention and clarity of your intention. Living from recognized creative power means every moment becomes quantum experiment, not as burden or constant effort, as natural awareness that how you focus consciousness influences what appears in experience. When decision needs making, you recognize your intention about outcome affects which outcome manifests, not absolutely controlling it, but influencing probability in direction of intention. When challenge appears, you recognize how you relate to challenge affects how challenge evolves, not through positive thinking, but through consciousness's genuine influence on quantum field that manifests as circumstances. Decision-making becomes conscious influence rather than passive hoping. You're not just analyzing options logically and hoping you choose correctly. You're holding clear intention about what you want to influence while remaining present and allowing field to respond to that intention. Sometimes response matches intention exactly. Sometimes response is different but serves better than what you intended. Sometimes no obvious response appears and you realize intention wasn't as clear or relaxed as you thought. But you're always consciously participating in probability rather than unconsciously accepting whatever randomly appears. Circumstances reorganize around your consciousness in observable ways, not magically or instantly, but consistently enough that correlation becomes undeniable. When you hold clear, relaxed intention without desperate attachment, situations align more favorably than randomness predicts. When you approach challenges with genuine curiosity rather than anxiety, solutions appear more readily. When you maintain flow state, synchronicities increase. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence once you're paying attention to correlation between consciousness state and manifestation. Doubt about creative power diminishes through accumulated evidence. At first you might question whether you're really influencing anything, but after dozens or hundreds of instances where intention correlated with outcome significantly more than chance explains, doubt becomes untenable. You don't believe consciousness affects reality. You know it does through direct, repeated verification. That knowing isn't arrogance. That knowing is recognition based on evidence. Same way you know breathing affects oxygen levels, through direct observable correlation. Purpose emerges as natural expression rather than something to discover or achieve. You're not searching for what you're meant to do or trying to figure out your calling. You're conscious creator, and what wants to create through you reveals itself when you're present and allowing, rather than forcing or controlling. Purpose isn't fixed destination to reach. Purpose is ongoing expression of consciousness creating through your particular form. And that expression shifts as you shift, evolves as you evolve, manifests naturally when interference is removed. I live from this recognition now. Every intention I hold, I recognize as quantum influence on probability. Every decision I make, I know my consciousness affects outcome. Every circumstance I encounter, I understand my relationship with it influences how it evolves. This doesn't mean perfect control. I don't control quantum field. This means conscious participation. I influence probability through quality of attention and clarity of intention, and I've verified through direct experience that influence is real, measurable, consistent with what forbidden experiment proved scientifically. There comes point where recognition of creative power proven by forbidden experiment becomes irreversible, not because you can't temporarily forget. Unconsciousness still happens occasionally, but because you've verified too many times that consciousness affects probability, accumulated too much direct evidence that intention influences outcomes, experienced too many correlations that can't reasonably be explained as coincidence. The recognition becomes permanent, not through belief, but through overwhelming evidence from direct, repeated experience. This irreversible shift happens when you've consciously influenced enough outcomes that pattern is undeniable to yourself. One instance you might dismiss, 10 you might rationalize. But after hundreds of instances where holding clear, relaxed intention correlated with outcome manifesting in alignment with that intention more frequently than randomness predicts, consistently enough that coincidence is statistically implausible, you can't unknow what evidence demonstrates. You don't believe consciousness affects reality. You know it does through personal verification of what science proved. The shift confirms itself through what no longer disturbs you. Circumstances that would have felt completely outside your control now feel partially influenceable through conscious intention. Challenges that would have seemed predetermined now feel malleable based on how you relate to them. Outcomes that would have appeared totally random now reveal subtle correlation with quality of your consciousness. You're not delusional or inflating your influence. You're recognizing patterns that were always operating, but you weren't conscious enough to detect. You also notice what no longer compels you. Need to control every outcome diminishes because you recognize control creates interference while allowing creates influence. Anxiety about future reduces because you know you're participating in creating future through present intention rather than being victim of predetermined fate. Dependence on external authority dissolves because you've verified through direct experience that you have creative power culture systematically denied you possess. Ancient teachings speak of gnosis, direct knowing that transcends belief or faith. That's what happens through repeated verification of consciousness affecting reality. You're not believing spiritual teaching, you're knowing through direct experience validated by scientific evidence. You're not having faith in manifestation, you're recognizing mechanism that operates consistently whether you believe in it or not. You're not hoping you have creative power. You're using creative power deliberately because you've proven to yourself it exists and functions exactly as Forbidden Experiment demonstrated. 10 years after discovering Forbidden Experiment and beginning to verify results through personal experience, I can't return to believing I'm powerless observer of predetermined reality. Not because I'm disciplined against that belief, because accumulated evidence makes that belief untenable. I've influenced too many outcomes, verified too many correlations, experienced too many instances where consciousness clearly affected probability. The pattern is as obvious to me as breathing affecting oxygen, not through faith, through repeated direct verification. If you're sensing this irreversible recognition stabilizing, write in comments, "I influence reality." That statement isn't arrogant claim or spiritual belief. That's recognition based on personal verification of what science proved. That consciousness affects probability. That intention influences outcomes. That you're not powerless. You're conscious creator whose power was systematically denied by culture, benefiting from your unconsciousness. Every video on this channel points toward recognizing creative power you've always had, but were conditioned to forget. Every teaching shares evidence that consciousness affects reality despite systematic suppression of that truth. Every transmission activates your recognition that you're creator, not just creation. If these teachings help you verify your creative power, subscribe. You're not learning about manifestation. You're remembering what you are. Consciousness that creates reality through how it focuses attention and holds intention. Everything shared until now has been preparing this exact moment. Not moment in future where you'll use knowledge. This moment, right now, where you either recognize your creative power and begin using it consciously, or dismiss what you've learned and return to unconscious creation through unexamined beliefs and automatic intentions. Where scientific proof either activates your recognition or becomes interesting information you eventually forget. Where consciousness either awakens to its own creative nature or remains unconscious despite evidence proving that nature exists. Take a breath, deep one, and as you breathe, recognize you're not just learning about Forbidden Experiment. You're conducting your own experiment right now. Your consciousness is influencing probability in this moment. How you focus attention affects what you experience next. What intention you hold influences what manifests. Quality of your awareness participates in creating your reality not someday but now, continuously, through mechanisms science proved exists, even while culture systematically denies it. In coming hours and days, experiment consciously. Hold clear intentions about simple outcomes. Notice correlation between intention and manifestation. Pay attention to how relaxed focus versus desperate forcing affects results. Observe how belief versus doubt influences whether outcomes align with intention. Verify for yourself what forbidden experiment proved. Consciousness affects probability when it operates with right qualities. Not as something to believe, as something to verify through direct experience. The experiment was forbidden because results proved you're not powerless. Because evidence demonstrated consciousness creates reality. Because science validated what mystics taught about your creative nature. And culture systematically suppresses that knowledge. Because your unconsciousness of creative power serves systems built on your learned helplessness. But suppression can't contain truth forever. Evidence exists. Experiment was conducted. Results are available. And now, you know. If this transmission activated your recognition of creative power, if you see clearly now that consciousness affects reality based on scientific proof rather than spiritual belief, share this. Others need to discover forbidden experiment. Others need to see evidence systematically hidden from public awareness. Others need to recognize their creators whose power was systematically denied. Truth that's suppressed needs to be liberated. And you can participate in that liberation by sharing what you've learned. Write final comment. Just, I create. That statement acknowledges recognition, that consciousness affects reality, that you're not powerless observer. That creative power, proven by forbidden experiment, operates through your awareness. That you're conscious creator participating in manifestation rather than victim experiencing predetermined fate. That you know this not through belief, but through understanding of scientific evidence validating what you've always intuitively sensed. This is quantum reflex. This is consciousness recognizing creative power proven scientifically but systematically suppressed. This is forbidden experiment revealing truth culture doesn't want you to know. You affect reality through focused intention and relaxed allowing. You create experience through how you interface with quantum field. You're not powerless. You never were. You were just conditioned to believe you are. And that conditioning served systems benefiting from your unconsciousness. The forbidden quantum experiment you were never supposed to see. But you saw it. You understand it. You recognize what it proves about you. You're not observer, you're creator. Consciousness affecting reality through intention and attention. In every moment, starting now. The experiment was forbidden, but truth can't be suppressed forever. Now you know.